very happy to introduce Andy Gibbs. Andy works at the Health Economics and HIV and AIDS Research Division at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, or HERD, and Strive and HERD have held a couple of conferences on structural drivers of HIV and published work together. Andy's focus is on masculinities, on gender-based violence, and on young people's sexual and reproductive health, particularly around interventions. We look forward to learning a lot from him in today's presentation about a specific intervention, and I hope you will have loads of questions afterwards. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, everyone, because I can see everyone joining, and I recognise lots of names of people I have met over the years or worked with or know from emails. So it's great everyone could join. So just to kind of kick off, what we were interested in is understanding structural interventions for young people. And I want to kind of really start to think through structural interventions for young people using the example of Stepping Stones in Creating Futures, which is a pilot that myself and a number of colleagues have been kind of integrally involved in for the last 3 or 4 years. We started thinking about this back in, I think, 2010. And I guess back then there was a lot of evidence that an interest in structural interventions, that they had an important role to play in reducing HIV and also intimate partner violence. And I guess the image study was really kind of impressive. It had been released in 2006, and there had been a number of attempts to kind of try and take those learnings and translate them through into what might this mean for young people, where there's kind of evidence that young people experience particularly high levels of violence. So what we started off by doing was conducting a review into the evidence and trying really to focus on Southern and Eastern Africa, where HIV is particularly acute. And I guess we found there are 3 main kind of approaches, which took gender kind of transformative interventions plus economic interventions together. So they were really kind of microfinance and gender interventions, really the image study, increasing girls' school attendance, and the Zomba cash transfer intervention, alongside a number of other studies had shown kind of a number of positive outcomes. And then there's some studies looking at gender training and financial literacy. And I guess when we were looking at them, we were saying, but still we don't know really what works. And we identified, I think, 3 big gaps in the evidence. Firstly, I think microfinance, brilliant as it is, doesn't really work for younger women. It works very well for older women who've got established businesses. So there's this kind of gap around young women who are out of school. I guess we'd also seen a number of flat findings. So the Shaz pilot is kind of well known for showing some interesting but kind of mixed findings in terms of it. And then Shaz has also kind of been redeveloped, kind of in response to that. The other kind of big study was the TRI study, the Tap and Reposition Youth, which also showed kind of the huge challenges of implementing these kind of interventions with young people. So that was one of the big things. How do we make these work for young people? And then there's a question of what do we do about men? You know, rightly, a huge focus had really been on women and looking at empowering women and kind of tackling the economic roots of women's kind of social and economic subordination to men. But it still left this big kind of question, you know, what do we do with men? And 1 or 2 studies had suggested if you give men money, you might actually see an increase in risk behaviours, but still there wasn't much evidence around that. And I guess the third thing was, how do we work in insecure spaces? Typically these studies have been done amongst schoolgirls or in rural areas, which, while brilliant for showing kind of effect and some of the challenges, you know, there was a growing recognition of how urban informal settlements were rapidly growing sites of high HIV prevalence and violence. So I guess they were the 3 kind of big gaps that we saw once we'd done this review. That really kind of left us with 2 problems. You know, how do we translate the approach that these economic strengthening interventions, when combined with gender transformative approaches, can reduce women's experience of IPV and HIV risk and also make it work? How can we make these work for young women in challenging circumstances? So we then also, the second big problem is, what do we do about men? How can we include men in ways that also reduce HIV risk and IPV perpetration and not exacerbate this? So these were kind of our two big problems that we faced as we started this work. How do we start to think about it and translate this evidence for young people and for men? And I think one of the key things I wanted to flag up just before we kind of dive in is the importance that we found with working with Project Empower, so the NGO who are incredibly kind of practically and theoretically engaged with these questions. And I think they managed to, through their kind of 10 to 15 years of experience, managed to make it work as well for us. So it's not just a kind of very academic process, but it's really been a collaborative process that has enabled us to kind of take Project Empower's on-the-ground learning, kind of translate it upwards into more academic and theoretical kind of ideas, and then kind of take it back into an intervention which we hope shows some promise. So I also just want to kind of quickly touch on urban informal settlements, and actually this is a settlement from kind of about 1 kilometre down the road from the university that I work in. And I guess what we've been seeing over the past number of years is huge growth in urban informal settlements. It's estimated about 23% of all households in South Africa live in these kind of spaces. And I think UNAIDS has very clearly shown that, in Southern and Eastern Africa, cities are a key space in which we need to work around HIV. There's a bit less data around gender-based violence in urban and rural areas, but the one study we did find was down in Cape Town, which explored rates of homicide. And they looked at different settlement types, and they basically showed urban informal settlements had rates of homicide of over 4 times that of wealthier formal settlements. So what we are seeing is these urban informal settlements, they're growing kind of quite rapidly, especially in Durban, where they estimate 2,000 to 3,000 young people come every month. And they're spaces which are incredibly hard but incredibly important to work in. So that's kind of the background, why did we do this, the space we're working in, and some of the things. So what did we do? So we took a version of Stepping Stones. So Stepping Stones is probably well known to many people. It was developed in the 1990s for Uganda by Alice Wellborn. And in that version, it sought to run kind of groups around gender, HIV, and sexual health with young people and with older people, and engage in both kind of cross-sex conversations but also intergenerational conversations. So we took a version of that, which had been evaluated in South Africa, which only worked with young people, so the Stepping Stones South Africa adaptation, which had been evaluated in an RCT by Rachel Jukes amongst school-going young people, and it had shown significant reductions in men's perpetration of intimate partner violence at 24 months. But interestingly, it hadn't shown any impact on women. And one of the kind of suggestions that kind of emerged from the qualitative data was because of the high levels of poverty that women experience and the kind of high levels of economic dependency that they have in relation to men. So we've got this kind of participatory, gender transformative intervention, which seems to show kind of a lot of promise, and it's been used kind of quite widely globally. So what we did do is develop an economic strengthening intervention called Creating Futures. So one of our kind of key things was that we weren't going to get involved in doing cash transfers, in providing micro loans or anything like that. The kind of upfront direct costs are very high, and there are huge kind of management difficulties. But we did want to take the kind of participatory approach of Stepping Stones and really get people to think, after they've thought about gender, HIV, kind of violence, can they translate some of their critical thinking, some of their skills they've developed, and start to think about, what can they do to maximize some of the job opportunities that they had. So this is 11 sessions. So in conjunction, so we run the stepping stones first and then kind of seamlessly feed into creating futures. So anybody going through the intervention receives 21 sessions. Each of them is single sex, or the majority are single sex, and they last about 3 hours. So it's pretty intensive stuff. It's about 60 hours of contact time run by trained facilitators. So that's kind of the session, the intervention that we developed over about a year and a half. And I just really want to kind of touch on the kind of theoretical approach, and I think often these aren't really kind of talked about too much. I think there are kind of two main theoretical approaches that are starting to dominate kind of HIV and IPV prevention interventions. The first kind of really draws on cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very kind of individualistic, US-developed approach, which tries to get people to recognize what triggers their behavior, be that violence, HIV risk behavior, and then identify what they could do in response differently. Ideas of self-efficacy are also kind of bound up in that. And while these are kind of important building blocks for thinking about change, they've shown very little ability to reduce IPV. And the big review that the What Works team did kind of makes that point very clearly. The other model, which I think most people are very familiar with, are kind of these group-based participatory interventions, really kind of building off Paulo Freire's ideas of behaviour change, as adapted by a number of social psychologists. Basically, instead of just getting people to recognise problems and issues, start to support them to think through about the issues of what are the underlying patterns, what are the underlying drivers, and so that they can start to see that their behaviours and their identities are, at some level, socially constructed, and that they can, therefore, start to develop alternative identities. And I think, the emphasis here is very much on experiential learning, and this data, which we often use, is really some young men kind of developing a sketch around violence against women and their responses, and how can they think through alternative responses, but also understand what are the kind of broader factors shaping their behaviour. So just to kind of dive into what we did for the intervention, this is where it gets a bit more kind of technical, I guess. So we implemented the intervention in 2 informal settlements, kind of quite close to the university, over about 12 weeks. There are about 233 young people, so quite a young age cohort, all of them out of school. Those trained peer facilitators delivered it. And then we did, for our evaluation, we did both a quantitative evaluation, which I'll talk mainly about, but also a lot of qualitative research around this. And I guess that's been quite important to understand not only what worked, but also to ask why did it work and what were the challenges in implementing. And I'll touch on some of those further on in the presentation. So just to give you a bit of sense about our young people, we've got about half men, half women. Almost all, 80% of them were under 25. Very few, kind of shockingly few, had actually completed school. And we're not even sure they'd actually got their kind of final school leaving certificate because of the question we asked, just that they'd been part of the final year of schooling. I guess high levels of partnering and high levels of having had children. So 2/3 of the women reported having at least one child, and 1/3 of men. And I guess another kind of shocking thing was that only 65% of men and 35% of women said they worked or earned in the last 12 months. So these are young people living in urban informal settlements who say they haven't really worked recently. The other kind of thing which was definitely shocking to the team were the high rates of violence perpetrated by men and experienced by women. So half the women and just under half the men said they'd either experienced or perpetrated violence in the last 12 months, which is between 3 and 5 times what we see in South Africa in a general population. These are very complex tables. What I'll do is kind of talk you through them. on the left, we've got the kind of two measures before the intervention happened, and then we've got measures at 6 months and at 12 months. And I'm kind of telling you the narrative of what we're seeing. Basically, for women and men, we saw that their incomes, their earnings in the past month increased kind of significantly. And that was significant for both of them. Men and women also felt better about their work situation, which is good. So we asked a series of questions about, do you feel ashamed about your work, and that you feel ashamed in front of your family that you don't have enough work. And so we seem to have made them change that. Interestingly, despite them starting to earn more, we didn't see any change in kind of food security, so hungry every day or week, and that remained constant. We did see a change in whether people had stolen in the last month because of hunger, but more widely we didn't see any change in crime participation. So we asked a series of questions about whether people had been involved in stealing things and breaking into houses or so on, and we didn't see any change there. So it seems that what we did see was kind of improving livelihoods in various ways. In terms of kind of gender indicators, which is kind of what we're particularly interested in, I think to kind of dive into the violence questions first, we didn't see any significant change about men's perpetration or women's experience of intimate partner violence in the past 3 months. There's some suggestion that kind of the men's perpetration was on a downward trend, but that doesn't hold up too well. What we did see, which is very interesting, is that women's experience of sexual violence from an intimate partner kind of declined significantly and in quite kind of large ways. And when you combine it together, we also see women's experience of physical and or sexual violence also declining. So it seems to have had an effect on women's experience of sexual violence. The men, while it didn't affect their kind of perpetration of violence, we did see improved gender attitudes. They became kind of more equitable. And also relationship control improved. So they became less controlling in their relationships. And there's lots of good evidence that that is linked to HIV risk and violence as well. So what did happen, though, for the men is that we seem to have made them happier. So we saw men's kind of depression kind of decrease significantly, and also their kind of perceptions about their life circumstances also improved significantly. We also encourage men to go and have an HIV test, which is obviously important. And interestingly, and we're not sure how this happened or why, men reported that the last person they'd had sex with was their main partner more at the final 12-month follow-up. So more men reporting the last person they'd had sex with was their partner rather than someone else. But lots of other kind of indicators didn't change. So just to kind of summarize very quickly what we did see then, we saw livelihoods improve with improved earnings, people feeling happier about work and less stealing because of hunger. Men were happier, which is obviously a good thing. And men's improved gender relationship. They were less controlling, more equitable attitudes, and so on. And for women, we saw women experience less intimate partner violence. So I just want to quickly kind of talk about the challenges of implementation. I guess one of our things was, can we deliver interventions in urban informal settlements? And I think what we did see was that while we could do it and we could follow people up, which is all very important for research purposes, there are huge kind of challenges in this as well. And we've kind of written a paper about this. So I guess what we wanted to point out in this paper is that kind of there are lots of arguments about food and dividing food up. So in sessions would provide food because these people were very hungry. And there'd be arguments about how to divide the food up and about whether you could take it home to your children or not. Taxi fares, as it was a pilot, we did it in the centre of town. And while we repaid people kind of immediately as they arrived, the poor are still struggling to kind of get this money to travel. And journals. One of the things we did do during the intervention is provide young people with a journal. Some of it kind of provided very concrete information about child support grants, but it also provided them a space for reflection. And people were incredibly possessive and concerned about other people seeing these. And some of the some of the women who were involved, their male partners got very angry about these and had some big arguments around it. And I guess, as one of the other authors kind of really summed it up, the factors, poverty, gender inequalities that we experienced in the implementation of the intervention are really the factors driving HIV and IPV in these communities. So a lot of the intervention has to be about helping young people navigate and kind of work around these on a daily basis. Just one or two things more. So really just moving forward, we are now about to start to conduct an RCT with 2-year follow-up on a much larger scale, funded by the DFID, What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women program, which will include an integrated cost-benefit analysis and process evaluation. So we'll be able to dig into a number of these questions in a lot more detail, which will be fabulous. And then just to kind of get back to where I started off. So what we did see is that despite the huge challenges, structural interventions for young people are possible, despite the issues we faced. And creating futures may have well strengthened the impact of stepping stones for women. We're still unsure of the overall impact of including men, but there certainly were no adverse effects of including them in this kind of combined intervention. So really just to say as a final thing that it really was a team effort. I've got my colleagues at the NRC, at HERD and at Project Empower, who have been kind of central to all of this, and we've written a series of papers throughout, which I mentioned, and then the team of facilitators, field workers and participants, and then these are all our vendors, so thanks ever so much.
Thanks so much, Andy. That was really, really interesting and thorough. Here's a question from Deirdre in Trocairn Island. She'd like to ask Andy a couple of questions. Firstly, the retention rates in the intervention. She wants to ask about that. Were many of the participants lost along the way? And secondly, the overall cost of the 12-week intervention. So, Andy, if you want to address those questions.
Yeah, no, they're very good questions. So the retention rates. So we think we've got about people attending 60% of sessions, which is a relatively low retention rate. So I think what we did find is that especially kind of young men and women were kind of trading off, they'd sometimes get a bit of work and then kind of drop out for a bit and then come back in. So, it's one of the things we'll be monitoring very closely in the kind of bigger evaluation to see does kind of attendance at session have impact on the overall kind of outcomes. The overall cost, I'm not sure of. We didn't keep, because it was a pilot, we didn't keep kind of the cost data in depth. But again, we're going back, or we're starting to, as part of the costing for the RCT, kind of go back and try and reconstruct the costs. So eventually we will kind of be able to give a cost on that. Sorry, I can't give exact things.
No, that's great. Joyce Wamoy from Tanzania is asking, what does improved life circumstances mean? So if you can break that down and explain how you measured that and what you were measuring.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joyce. I'm now trying to open my questionnaire. So basically, we asked men and women a series of questions. They kind of varied from, in most ways, my life is close to ideal. The conditions of my life are excellent. So kind of questions, and then quite a nice one, actually. You'd like to think about yourself as a woman in this case, and think about what is important. Do you think you've been very successful or not at all? So it's really kind of their perceptions of, are they living a good life, and are they where they'd like to be, given they're young people.
Okay, this is Edmore Marinda. One comment and a question. I saw you reported average income increase of almost 250% within a year, which is sort of unusual in South Africa. I wonder, is there any sort of reason why, were they getting quality jobs, were they changing jobs? So that's one question. Then the other one, in terms of I just wanted to find out in terms of your analysis, what sort of analysis did you do? I know this is a technical question, but how complex was it? I'm imagining, if you look at all these factors, they are sort of interrelated. I was looking at your income and then happiness, you get more money, you are happier. And therefore, do you look at sort of, bivariate, univariate analysis? Did you do any sort of structural modeling on your data? Thank you.
For quantitative analysis, it's essentially a very simple analysis. Because we don't have a control group, we actually can't do that much analysis. And we're just looking at trends in the data rather than seeking to say anything bigger. The paper, which is an open access paper, and I think is mentioned on the Strive website, helps. It kind of can provide you with details on the exact analysis we did. In terms of kind of trying to understand why did they increase so much, it was a huge increase, and you rightly pointed out that, over 200%, and I think one of them might have been 300% even. So I guess one of the things is they're working off an incredibly low starting base. Lots of people at baseline reported zero earnings in the past month. And so, kind of moving off from zero, anything is a huge increase. So I think some of it is just the incredibly low kind of earnings that they made at the start. I guess, what did their jobs do? Yeah, it's kind of been one of our big questions. We've got some very nice qualitative research that suggests that some people did move into kind of slightly better paying, more secure jobs. One of them, I can remember, described kind of being a courier and then getting a job with a kind of a low-level job at a kind of biggish firm doing something with electricity. But I think that's been one of the big things. I suspect what we did was get people to accept kind of low-paying jobs just more, recognition that that's kind of a pathway into something else. So it's a kind of the tricky thing about kind of the types of work that we got them to do. It wasn't brilliant work for sure.
Moving on, we have a question from Sonali. She wants to know what outcome measures will be used in the RCT, in the upcoming RCT. And she also wanted to ask about, mention the limitation of self-reporting, of perpetuating intimate partner violence. Is it validated by asking partners, or how do you assess those answers?
Great questions, and it's one of those ones that everyone is grappling with. So the very simple answer to the outcome measures is that we'll use a kind of modified WHO questionnaire on intimate partner violence, which asks, I think it's 4 questions on physical violence, 5 on physical violence and 3 on sexual violence. And it is self-reported and it's highly limited. Because we've got 2 baselines 2 weeks apart from the pilot, we are in the process of looking at, do people change their reporting 2 weeks later, and if so, by how much. So we're hopefully going to have some idea of whether we can kind of trust is the wrong word, but the stability of reporting. We're not going to be asking partners in this upcoming RCT. For some of the qualitative work, we did ask men's main female sexual partners qualitatively about their experiences, and they really do provide a nice triangulation and a bit of extra evidence to see whether we can kind of understand and, how do people report.
Priya Pillai from India is asking about the process of getting young men to reflect. How did you facilitate that? What did it involve? And again, raising that same question about dropout, but particularly of boys and how you might have dealt with that.
One of the things we did learn about getting young men to reflect was the importance of having kind of other men facilitate it who could relate to young people's experiences. We had some facilitators who were from very similar backgrounds, and when they got told, relatively shocking things in terms of kind of their experiences on a daily basis, were just like, okay, I can accept that, and while other people were quite shocked by it. So I think that was quite important, and as we go forward, we've put quite a lot of thinking into what will make a good male facilitator. Because the other thing is, should you go for someone who kind of casts aside on the kind of male stereotypes, like a self-identified gay man, who challenges them? So there are kind of lots of questions around that, which we're still kind of grappling with. The facilitation, I guess, it was a mixture of kind of discussions. There was some body mapping. I know Creating Futures has a number of games in it. There's quite a lot of role play. So it's a wide range of techniques, both kind of group-based, and Creating Futures moved very much more to an individual kind of focus at times, getting people to reflect individually on their life and, what they can do kind of work-wise. Yeah, the boys dropping out, as I said, I guess the issue was a lot to do with them needing to seek work at the same time. We did try and follow them up, and often that would help, but, the issues that they face are just so huge that, they were quite good at navigating themselves and making decisions about whether it was good to go to sessions or not. But again, we will be putting a lot of effort into ensuring people are followed up as we do it on a bigger scale.
Great. The next question is from Nambusi Chagombe, who thanks you for a really interesting presentation. She says, I was interested to hear about some of the components of the Creating Futures intervention. How did young people, particularly the girls and women, receive support to budget and understand their expenditure? And do you have a sense of the extent to which transactional sex featured in their strategies to meet their needs and aspirations?
I guess we haven't looked at the women's qualitative data in the depth yet. The person who will be writing that paper has other things to kind of focus on at the moment, so I can't really give you a good answer, Nambusi, unfortunately. I think transactional sex was quite a feature, but I don't know to what extent it was kind of just to meet their needs or whether they used it as a more aspirational kind of component of their livelihood strategies. I do know from kind of, even before we ran the pilot, we did a series of kind of pre-tests of the Creating Futures manual, and we were all very surprised at how much women still wanted or still believed that a young man would come along and kind of whisk them away and provide for them and support all their needs. So it's not exactly transactional sex, but there was this kind of ongoing assumption that this would be a way forward, where in reality none of them were in these kind of relationships. They all had very challenging relationships where they were expected to provide for themselves. So I can't really answer it very well, Nambusi, unfortunately. But hopefully when we get a proper look at it, we will be able to give a better answer.
Thanks, Nambusi, for that question. Then the next one we have from Maseko on saying, in the Stepping Stones document sent with the webinar info, it mentions that Stepping Stones has been adapted for a younger age group. Do you have any information about that?
I don't, but I can see Alice is online and she's being sent onto that adaptation. So I don't know if Alice can provide a quick update on where it's at.
So I'm really sorry, I missed almost all of your presentation, Andy. But basically, stepping stones with children and their caregivers. We did a webinar on the IATT for UNICEF and WHO last week, and I can send through the link for that to you all if you'd like, when that's, because that was recorded also, when that's up on their site. And meantime, if you'd like to look at the Stepping Stones website, there's information about it there, which I could just put in the Skype chat now if you'd like. Sorry, that's for 5 to 8-year-olds, 9 to 14-year-olds, orphans and vulnerable children, and their caregivers.
So I hope that answers the question. So thanks very much, Alice. That's great and useful for people to have reference to across to particular information about stepping stones. Now moving on to Sophie's question, she says, thanks for a great presentation. Just wondering if you have any hypothesis around why earnings went up, but reported hunger didn't seem to decrease as might be expected. She also wonders if you have any thoughts on the alcohol measure that seemed to increase for women.
To deal with the alcohol question, yeah, it did go up, and significantly so, I think. We're not sure why. We haven't been able to kind of dig into it in enough detail. I guess, it would be that they started to earn more money and were possibly more able to buy it for themselves. What we did see, though, and this is our kind of positive spin on it, is that arguments about alcohol, women's kind of arguing about this with their partners, seem to decrease. So it seems that kind of one of the key issues, kind of arguments, around alcohol seem to go down. So we don't know why. That is something we will be kind of watching very carefully, because obviously it's not a great outcome to see an increase in drinking. Why did hunger or food insecurity didn't go down? We just used a one-item question, so it could be the question wasn't very kind of specific. They're better standardized approaches. We're going to be using kind of 3 items, so it might just be simply the question we asked wasn't very good. It could be that the people that we're making better off aren't the most poor, aren't the poorest, aren't the most food insecure. So, but again, our data set isn't kind of big enough to kind of start asking those complex questions, but hopefully, as always, we'll be able to say something more in a couple of years.
Great. I'm putting Carol Wren's question onto the chat box so everyone can see it. She wants to ask about the training of facilitators. What type of training did they receive and how long was that process? This is something that Andy and I were talking about before the webinar, was about the importance of this really skilled facilitation with this kind of intervention. So Andy, if you could outline that a bit.
Yeah, so for this we did, I think for the pilot it was about 4 weeks of training. So everybody on the facilitators and also the field workers experienced kind of the whole of, our intervention as participants. So everyone went through the kind of shortened stepping stones and everyone went through creating features. So they kind of experienced it as participants run by a kind of very skilled facilitator. We then had about a week of content, so where we went over some of the key kind of issues, so people had better kind of basic knowledge about it. And then we did a week of kind of practice facilitation. And 1 or 2 of those days were on, this is what good facilitation is. They're kind of more kind of examples of how to do facilitation rather than doing it using one of the manuals. But kind of based on that experience, and then one of the papers that we've been kind of working on is kind of facilitators' experiences of the intervention. Project Empower has decided to go for a slightly longer training approach for the RCT, for the new facilitators. So they'll be doing 5 weeks, and they'll be upfronting a lot more of the kind of, the theory of facilitation and the basic skills of facilitation. So starting with, how do you get groups to work and what are good kind of group facilitation techniques before introducing people actually to kind of the two manuals. So it is very intensive. We get questions about costs of it, but I guess we're quite committed to the approach theoretically. So, and this is one of the kind of components of the approach, to have highly skilled facilitators who can lead kind of processes of change.
There's obviously a lot of interest in the question of facilitation. Here's a question from Sonali, which I'm broadcasting on that chat box. What were the key behavior change techniques that appear to have contributed to behavior change? And she also was asking about the question of a manual, which I think you've answered pretty much.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much more to say beyond, I guess, the real emphasis was on promoting dialogue and discussion and getting people to really engage. I think when I started off kind of getting interested in these things, I can remember Kathy Campbell being in one of her lectures at LSE and her going, too often people see facilitation as this and showing kind of these kind of rows of people sitting like at school with someone at the front. And these didactic kind of approaches. And, I guess that's what we've tried to move away from in the sessions. Look, obviously, as it happens, facilitators, while they are trained, they still have tendencies, like everyone, to slip backwards into kind of more lectury mode. So it really is this ongoing challenge, for people. To kind of overthrow their histories of education and what they've experienced previously.
No, that's great. I think it's a really important distinction to make. Here's another question asking about the group size. Is this a fixed number, 20 people, based on the level of engagement and the skills of the facilitator? Can you enlarge the size without affecting the quality?
I actually don't know. I guess it would be really the skills of the facilitators it's raised. If you've got a skilled facilitator and they've got good techniques of kind of lots of breaking people into small groups, you can get away with larger numbers. So I can't imagine 25 people would be too hard for people to facilitate if they've got those techniques and are confident. But, they're not. Yeah, I guess in the group sessions, in the whole group sessions, it could get quite hard. But I'm sure there are ways around it if you are a skilled facilitator.
One more from Sonali. Fidelity of intervention implementation measured. Oh, how? How did you measure that?
There's the second question. We didn't really measure it. I guess it's, that raises a big question. To what extent is, in participatory approaches, is there kind of fidelity, and to what extent should facilitators kind of be allowed to take it where the group goes or kind of keep everyone on track? Because it isn't such a kind of structured process. The idea of, fidelity might be a bit hard, which is basically to say we didn't measure it. We did have a senior facilitator who was always available and would drop in, and we did regular weekly meetings to kind of get feedback, but there we tried to really push, not, did you cover these in correct detail? Although that did start to slip in, and quite possibly that was my fault, from the research side because of those questions of fidelity. But yeah, there's a lot more focus on, how was the process, how did people experience things.
Right. We have one more question from Daniel Nyato, also from Tanzania, asking how you see this work influencing structures on a larger scale. So, for instance, the livelihood opportunities, but also, I guess, the implementation in general, the intervention in general. Are there ways that this, what's come out of this study, can move forward for instance, with local governments putting these findings into action?
It's a great question, because that's one of the big things. Can we scale up models such as stepping stones creating futures through government structures, or are they just too large and unwieldy to kind of really use? So the simple answer is we're not at this point really engaging local government, as a kind of modality to deliver the intervention. Something we've kind of talked about, and there are certainly opportunities in South Africa. We've got quite a large community works program, an expanded works program, and also in social development we've got various cadre of kind of low-paid, relatively low-skilled people who would be kind of the opportunity to deliver it. So at the moment we haven't really started thinking about how can we influence wider structures at this point. I guess it's also the big critique of all of these kind of interventions is that, from microfinance through to kind of this creating futures type model is that, we aren't actually tackling the much wider structural factors that, of economic processes. We're rather just creating a bit of space for people to maneuver in and to individually or collectively kind of be able to navigate the structures slightly better. So when we call them structural interventions, there is quite a big debate about whether they really are structural of the structural kind, or whether there's something in between those kind of like these macro level structures or not.
I think that is a really important question, and like many of them, it's opened a door into so much other thinking. There's obviously a lot that we want to know more about in terms of the intervention as a program, as well as the research study and the details of that, and as well as how to take this learning forward. I hope, Andy, that we can keep up to date with the papers coming out as a result of your work of this program. Yeah. It'd be great if you can keep us up to date. I don't know if you have any last points you'd like to make.
So thank you for having me do this webinar. It's been great, and the questions have been really interesting.